Hello, I'm Anavultus, and today I'm going to be talking about human rights from a Christian perspective. And I'm going to front load this by saying that from a Christian perspective, I think that human rights, as they are traditionally conceived through more humanist perspectives, actually don't exist. And I'll go over a little bit about why I think that. But first of all, let me just say that this video is from a Christian perspective and from a perspective of people that know theology, or at least know the Bible sufficiently to understand what I'm talking about without having to get a citation of every single verse every single moment, because otherwise that would get very tedious. But anyway, getting back into the issue here, human rights are, of course, a type of right, and rights deal with justice. But in the Bible, the idea of human rights per se, as in literally the term human rights, doesn't appear. Now, some people might take that as meaning that it's completely irrelevant. But I think that from our legal discussions today, it is relevant because the issue of justice and morality are discussed quite frequently and heavily in the Bible. Therefore, human rights, as dealing with justice and morality, are also important topics to discuss, even from a biblical standpoint, because even though they are not discussed directly, we can gain a lot of information about how we should view these things by looking at the general discussion of justice and also how that plays out in the Bible. Now, that being said, there are three different general approaches to justice that a lot of Christians use. Now, one is the divine command theory, that is to say that things are right and wrong based on the commands of God. Then the second one would be an analysis of God's character, and therefore things are right and wrong based on God's character and based on imitating God's character. The third one is nature, that is to say that things can be understood as right and wrong based on the nature of creation, whether it is the nature of the humans themselves or the nature of the surrounding creation or the natural interactions of humans with creation. So in that sense, there are three different perspectives here. Now, anyone that has viewed my channel for a long time will know that I generally prefer the first one, but I want to discuss the other two real quick in order to understand what is happening here and how human rights work. Now, on the third one here, the idea of natural law and therefore natural rights, natural human rights from a Christian perspective, it is important to note that this natural rights idea, it falls into a major problem pretty quickly once you really examine into it. And that is, one, the problem of sin, therefore the corruption of nature. And that leads to a secondary problem, and that is the problem of hermeneutics. That is to say, how do you interpret nature, and how do you separate the corrupt and the uncorrupt parts of nature in order to gain a full image of what is right and wrong? And are you even meant to use this as your primary analysis on how these things work? Now, before I continue, let me just emphasize a couple of things, and that is that it's important to make a distinction between things being right and wrong and how you know things are right and wrong, and also whether people are entitled to know that things are right and wrong, and also the fourth one, whether people should be able to choose whether to do right and wrong things. Those are four entirely different topics. And what I'm speaking of in the sense of justice is the absolute perspective of whether things are actually right and wrong. Now, I don't deny that there are some things that can be known from nature, but I don't think nature is designed to be that ultimate determination of whether things are right and wrong, because ultimately your hermeneutics on nature, that is how you interpret nature as referring to justice, if it's not based on a higher principle, it doesn't work. Now, you might say logic should be that higher principle. Logic, reason, rationality, consistency. But the problem with that is that you then need a reason, a logic, a rationality, and a consistency to justify your use of reason, logic, rationality, and consistency. So ultimately, you end up operating on a system of blind faith that has no ultimate source. So in that sense, if you simply go that far, you're still taking God out of the equation. So what if you put God into the equation? You say that God created nature, and God told us that he created nature, and therefore nature is relevant because God created it, and it is something that is incumbent upon us. Now, that is useful, but God did not just create nature and leave it at that. God also gave us prophets. God also, Jesus, incarnated. So in that sense, we have nature, but we have something much greater than nature. So a big part of Thomas Aquinas's idea of natural law is that these things generally are important in the context of people not knowing what has been revealed. In other words, from that perspective, it is only relevant for people that don't actually have the verbatim revelation of God, the prophecies, the discussion by the apostles, and the words of Jesus Christ. People that don't have that have to rely on nature. And that is Thomas Aquinas's perspective on that. But again, this goes back then to the idea of the human nature being corrupt, and therefore humans themselves can't really give an accurate moral code simply from their internals. Now, that's not to say that God hasn't given people consciences to know what is right and wrong in a more general sense, but that these things are rather obscured by the human's self-interest, in evil self-interest that manifests in a number of different ways, including the greed and the desire to acquire things and qualities that it is not proper for them to acquire. So from a generally liberal discussion of rights, people say that all things go back to property rights. That is what a lot of liberals say, or particularly libertarian people today, because liberal has different meanings throughout history. So I'm speaking in a more classical sense here, that property rights are generally the center of this. But if we're talking about property rights as human rights, we have to understand that humans aren't the only ones that have property. God also has property. In fact, all property is God's property ultimately. So in that sense, it is something that is not unique to humans, and therefore it is something that is not internal to humans, and is therefore not something that, from a natural rights perspective, can be described as a uniquely human right. Because if we make a Venn diagram with God on one side and humans on the other side, and in between the overlap zone is the fact that humans are made in the image of God, in other words, the common qualities that God has with humans, what we see is that the ownership of property is a common quality and not an exclusive human property. And since humans came after God, it is not even an original human quality. So in that sense, it is, well, saying they came after God is also a kind of silly way to put it, because God is eternal. So it's not as if there's something after God, because God doesn't have a beginning or an end. Let me just clarify that. But what I'm saying here is that for a natural perspective, that is to say, if we're talking about human nature and not interpreting the surrounding nature, which of course becomes impossible to do 100% accurately unless you have a revelation from God of some sort, whether it be through your conscience or through direct revelation. Through the human nature itself, for a human right to be derived from the human nature, it would have to be something that is part of the exclusive element on one side of that Venn diagram, something that is unique to humans alone, something which God does not have. Now, that being said, what are some unique human things? So, or to be more exact, what are some things that humans have that God does not have, in general speaking, anyway? Physicality is one of those things, and you might say, well, what about Jesus Christ, God become flesh? It's not a mixture of the natures. It's not a compounding of the natures. So, in other words, Jesus didn't cease to be God when he also became human. And so generally what we would view this as is a situation where if we go back to the Venn diagram, the hypothetical Venn diagram, we have the circle of God, and then we add the semicircle of human as a separate component there. And there are some people that believe that there's a doubling of the in-between elements to some degree. I disagree with that. I don't think that makes sense. I don't think that it makes sense to say that that would be true, because I think that leans into a weird idea of Jesus being two persons. And then the question comes up whether Jesus has one will or two wills, and then that depends on your theological position on whether the will is linked with the nature or linked with the person. I like to link it with the person, although I'm in the minority position there, and I think it's important to emphasize that I'm in the minority position there because I don't want people to get the wrong idea. Anyway, getting back on track, the discussion of natural rights and human law, therefore, from a humanist perspective, as applied to Christianity, doesn't make sense. And it's not just in that sense that it's not derived from the nature, but it also is important to note that saying then, what about God's nature? What if we just imitate God in everything that we do, and then maybe we'll be good people? Or let's say maybe we can't do that because it's not possible to be good in that sense through your own ability, but that is the essence of what is good, to imitate God. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. Problem one is that you're not God. You're a different being. And problem two, you're not intended to be like God in every way. In other words, you're not God, and you're not intended to become like God in that respect. And what do I mean by this? This is very clearly demonstrated in Genesis, when this is actually one of the arguments that the serpent uses to try to get Adam and Eve to partake of the forbidden fruit. And that is the idea of becoming like God. In other words, to imitate God to the fullest degree possible. And this is, in fact, an evil thing. It is something that is not moral for them to have. It is something that they do not have a right to. And therefore, it is something that it is evil for them to do. So saying that the essence of being moral is to be like God is actually wrong. Because humans are not God, and they're not meant to be exactly like God. Because to be exactly like God would be to either choose to be an equal as a God, or to usurp the place of God and become a God. And that is not something that is moral from the Christian perspective. So in that sense, it's important to understand that the second perspective of the three main perspectives is also incorrect. So what about the third perspective, divine command? And let me be clear that this is not to say that God's moral character is irrelevant, because I think that what is right for humans to do is determined by not only by God's will and his character, but also by his power. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we take the potter analogy, that is to say that there's a potter and he's got some clay that he's turning into a pot. What if after being done with the pot, the potter decides to just leave it somewhere on the roadside and never look at it again, and just abandons it and never interacts with it ever again, or he sells it to someone and never interacts with the pot ever again? Does what the potter thinks about the pot afterwards, if he's never going to interact with it again, does that really matter to the pot? The answer is it doesn't. In other words, what I'm saying is, as I wrote in my book, Actionable Justice, justice is not only an idea, justice is also an action. That is to say that it needs to be actualized. Justice not only needs to be posited, but it also needs to be enforced for it to be relevant. And what we have is that God didn't abandon his creation. He didn't sell it off somewhere else. God interacted with it. God had a plan from the beginning, a plan from eternity even, a plan that he carries out for what purpose? To glorify himself. And what does he use to carry out this plan? His power. God is almighty. Therefore, in that perspective, from an absolute sense, it is true that might makes right. Because God has all the might, and because he has all the might, he is capable of determining all the right. Because if there were a being equal to God, that is to say, another God, then God wouldn't have all the might, because there would be another being that had a might of equal measure. And if that were true, then if that being also had a will contrary to the first being, then what we would have is a situation where justice, in an absolute sense, doesn't exist, or only exists insofar as each being is capable of asserting its preferences upon the world. So in that sense, it is important to understand that what determines ultimately what is right and wrong is the combination of God's will and God's power. So, and of course, God's will and God's power come from God's character. So that's where we get back to the character. So this, in essence, is a type of positivism. In other words, that a statement from authority and then the enforcement of that statement is what creates the morality in general. Now, of course, many types of positivism are atheistic, and this is obviously not an atheistic type of positivism. But I think that God has also instituted this system, not only in his own capacity, but also in a hierarchy, as God anoints and appoints the rulers of this world regardless of which country they rule. And then he holds them accountable in his eternal judgment. Therefore, it is true to say that to break the law is an evil thing, even if it is a law that you might not agree with wholly. Now, that being said, there is still the higher law. So if you break the higher law, then you have obviously gone against God in a direct sense. But if there's a higher law and a lower law, and the lower law does not contradict the higher law, but you still choose to break the lower law, what you have is a situation where you still have opposed God by opposing God's appointed ruler in this world. So that's a perspective, and that comes primarily from Romans chapter 13 on that. But there are other parts in the scriptures that mention this idea, and this is why Jesus tells people to pay their taxes, because you look at the coin that you have, and it has the symbols of the country that is ruling you. And therefore, it is true that that country's justice is being instituted in your land. Therefore, you are under that country's jurisdiction. And because you are under that country's jurisdiction, it is natural to say, and that is not to say from nature, but logical to say, that God has placed you under the jurisdiction of that country. And if you refuse the jurisdiction of that country, it is similar to refusing a command from God. Now, that is not to say that we should have high and mighty opinions of our rulers far beyond their status, but it is to say that the rebellious spirit that many people have against God is also expressed to a lesser extent in the rebellious spirit that many people have against their governments. Which is not to say that if we have the opportunity to improve our governments, we shouldn't do it. But it is to say that if it is not our right to do so, then we should not expect to be to get away with it. That is to say that. So, going back onto the idea of human rights, therefore, human rights are not determined by the nature of humans themselves, but rather they are determined by God's decree. That is to say, universal rights. But it is worth noting that many rights that people imagine humans have, they don't actually have. For example, the story of Jonah. Jonah was called by God to be a prophet to the Assyrians, to ask them to repent. But Jonah resisted and chose to attempt to escape God's calling and ran far away and boarded a ship and tried to escape. And God pursued him and forced him and coerced him until Jonah would do what God had demanded of him. In other words, Jonah did not have a right to refuse God's calling. Jonah did not have a right to refuse to associate with the Assyrians, as Jonah was partially motivated by his desire to see the Assyrians destroyed and hoping that the Assyrians would not repent so that God would be just in destroying them. So ultimately, Jonah's autonomy was not respected because Jonah does not have an autonomy as a right. Autonomy means rule over yourself, the making laws over yourself, self-law, autonomos. So that is the Greek to say. But therefore, Jonah did not have a God-given right to determine his own purpose in life. He did not have a God-given right to choose who he would associate with. He did not have a God-given right to choose where he would go. So in that sense, we see that what people imagine humans have as rights don't actually exist. Another example in Jonah's life is later on. God caused a plant to grow to shade Jonah as Jonah was sitting outside of a city. And Jonah enjoyed this very much. But then God sent a creature to destroy the plant. And then Jonah was very discomforted. And he complained. But Jonah did not have a right to question God's judgment. He did not have a right to question why God caused him suffering. And that is something that is very important to note, that humans do not have a right to escape suffering. Furthermore, the story of Joseph. Joseph, at the time, he was the youngest of his brothers. He was betrayed by them. They were in a conspiracy against him, and they sold him into slavery and declared him dead. And then afterwards, Joseph was sold to slavery in Egypt, and he was falsely accused of a crime and therefore falsely imprisoned thereafter. And afterwards, it is said that what his brothers had meant for evil, in other words, what his brothers had done with evil intent, God the whole time was in control and he had meant it for good. In other words, the good that God produces, in other words, the right that God produces in what he does and in which he glorifies himself, is not something that is compatible necessarily with an enjoyable and a pleasurable experience in life. It is not something that is compatible with a state of remaining free. It is not something that is compatible with a state of remaining unaccused of false crimes. It is not compatible with a state of remaining unimprisoned for false reasons. So in that sense, it is worth noting that you could probably put up an example of pretty much anything that happens in real life that contradicts this idea that God chooses to enforce these universal rights upon all humans. Because even those upon whom God shows favor do end up suffering in various ways. In other words, it is not a human right, because God is in control. Let no one make the mistake in saying that God is powerless to stop any of the evil and injustices in this world. God is in control, and he chooses to allow these things to happen. Why? Because it ultimately serves a greater purpose in his glorification and in the revelation of his eternal attributes. So, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that human rights, as people commonly imagine them, don't exist. God is powerful enough to enforce any and all rights upon all people that he could and would give them. The fact is that God does not do so by choice. God does not have a universal right that he affords all people by simple virtue of them being humans. God has a final judgment, but this final judgment is not only reserved for humans, but presumably also for Satan and the devils, the demons. So it is to say that this right of judgment is a right that is not a right of the people themselves as evildoers, but rather is a right that God affords to himself in order to establish his eternal justice and also his mercy. So in that sense, it is important to understand that human rights don't exist at all. What does exist is God's promises. What does exist is God's mercy. What does exist is God's calling for salvation. God calls people to be saved from their sin because they cannot save themselves from their sin and naturally have no desire to do so. It is God that instills them with this ability to seek them because naturally no one seeks God. Naturally, all people are evil. So then going back to Thomas Aquinas' idea of how could the heathens be good without having the revelation of Jesus Christ, without having God's prophecies, without having a direct impact of God in their lives? The answer is that they cannot be good without God's direct action in their lives, because the ultimate good is to love God. Second to which, there is the good of loving your neighbor. But if you love your neighbor, but do not love God, are you properly loving your neighbor? That is a big and important question. Because if you exist in a state of willing ignorance of God's power, in a state of rebellion against God, if you exist in such a state, how could your intentions at all be in line with God's ultimate goal of his self-glorification? The answer is your intentions are not in line with that, and therefore all things you do, even if from an external human perspective they might seem like things that are good and beneficial, are not actually things that are good and beneficial because they have an ulterior motive. Or to be more exact, a motive that deviates from the good. Because the good is determined by God, but if you reject God, and you reject his authority and his power, then the good is no longer something that you are seeking. And therefore, you become a slave to sin, even if your actions are actions that generally people would look up upon. Because it is said that your righteousness, that the righteousness that people have is like filthy rags. That there is no one that does good, no one that seeks God. And that is why God's grace and mercy is so great and important because despite the fact that all people are naturally opposed to God, God chooses to save them anyway. And he chooses to do this through a sacrifice, a substitutionary atonement where the sins of God's people are placed upon Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ's righteousness is placed upon God's people. And therefore, in the eyes of God, now they have the righteousness of Christ because they died on the cross with Christ. And the substitutionary atonement occurred there at the cross. And that is very important. So anyway, tell me what you think. Do you disagree with any point I made? If you have a well thought out opinion, I would be glad to hear it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time. Anavultus over and out.